attend. It all gets connected to one central profile that the government can access whenever they want, for whatever reason they decide is important. They're marketing this as the ultimate convenience. Think how easy it'll be, they say. No more fumbling with multiple cards or passwords. One simple digital identity for everything. But you know what? The most convenient thing for a prison guard is when all the inmates are locked in their cells. Convenient for whom, exactly? This isn't some far-off possibility we're talking about. Right now, across the Atlantic, our allies in Britain are rolling out something called the Brit Card, and watching what's happening there is like getting a preview of coming attractions. The British government started with all the same friendly language we're hearing here. They said it would streamline services, enhance security, and prevent another scandal like what happened to the Caribbean immigrants who couldn't prove their right to be in the country after living there for decades. They even claimed it would stop people from crossing the English Channel in small boats. Though, anyone with half a brain can see that's complete nonsense. People working in the underground economy aren't exactly worried about carrying official government identification. But here's where it gets disturbing, and why every American should be paying attention. The Brit Card isn't just about proving who you are online. It's about building a centralized, state-controlled digital identity system that connects your finances, your medical history, your travel movements, your social media activity, and even your real-world social interactions. It's like a digital dog collar, and once it's clipped around your neck, you can't take it off. Now, the British government is calling it optional for now. Sound familiar? Remember when they said the same thing about vaccine passports? Oh, it's just temporary, they said. Just for public health, they promised. Nobody's forcing you to get one, they insisted. But within weeks, you couldn't get into a restaurant or fly on an airplane without showing your papers. I'm pretty sure the Brit Card will be following exactly the same playbook. Once these systems are in place, they become incredibly easy to expand, quietly, incrementally, until suddenly you need your digital ID to apply for a job, then to rent an apartment, then to take public transportation, then to open a bank account. And before you know it, what was once optional becomes absolutely essential for anything you want to do in modern society. Here's the thing that should make every American's blood run cold. This same pattern is already starting here in the United States. We might not have a Brit Card, but we're building the infrastructure for the same system, piece by piece, regulation by regulation, convenience by convenience. Think about how much has already changed just in the past few years. Your driver's license is becoming a real ID whether you like it or not. Your banking is moving digital whether you want it to or not. More and more services require you to verify your identity online using systems that track and store everything you do. Each step seems reasonable by itself, but when you connect the dots, the picture that emerges should terrify anyone who values freedom. The question isn't whether the government can legally create a mandatory digital ID system. They can't just wave a magic wand and make it happen overnight. Any mandatory system would require new legislation, just like when they tried this before with the Identity Cards Act back in the 2000s in Britain, which, by the way, got repealed because people fought back against it. But here's what's different now. They don't need to make it legally mandatory if they can make it practically impossible to live without. And that's exactly what's happening. Look around you. How much of your life already depends on digital systems? Your banking, your healthcare, your shopping, your communication with family and friends. Each of these systems is already collecting data about you, already tracking your behavior, already building a profile of who you are and what you do. A unified digital ID doesn't create surveillance, it just makes the surveillance more efficient. And once that infrastructure is in place, flipping the switch from optional to required becomes as simple as changing a few lines of code. No dramatic legislation needed. No big announcements. Just quiet changes to terms of service and compliance requirements that make it impossible to function in modern society without your digital papers. This is what I call the incremental trap, and it's how every surveillance state in history has been built, not through dramatic coups or sudden oppression, but through 1,000 small compromises that each seem reasonable by themselves. First, they make it convenient. Look how easy this is. No more waiting in lines or filling out paperwork. Then they make it preferred. You can still do things the old way, but the new way is so much faster. Then they make it standard. Most people are using the digital system now, so we're phasing out the old options. And finally, they make it mandatory. For security reasons, we now require digital verification for all transactions. Each step builds on the last, and each step normalizes a little more control, a little more surveillance, a little more dependency on systems you don't control and can't opt out of. By the time people realize what's happened, resistance is painted as extremism, and going back to the old way becomes practically impossible. We've seen this exact pattern with so many things that are now part of daily life. Remember when you could fly without showing identification? Remember when you could open a bank account with just a handshake and your word? Remember when you could use cash for everything and nobody thought it was suspicious? Each of those freedoms was traded away for promises of security and convenience, and each time we were told it would never be expanded beyond its original purpose. But that's not how power works. Power expands. It always expands. Give someone a tool for control, and they will find new ways to use it, no matter what they promised when you first handed it over. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of the digital ID system. It's not just about identification. It's about tying your identity to your money, and when the government controls both your identity and your money, they control you completely. This is where central bank digital currencies come into play, programmable money that can be turned on and off like a light switch. Imagine your bank account, but instead of being controlled by a private bank that at least has to compete for your business, it's controlled by the same government that decides what's acceptable speech, what's acceptable behavior, and what's acceptable thinking. With the digital ID tied to programmable money, here's what becomes possible. Your account gets flagged because you donated to the wrong political candidate. Your transactions get frozen because you attended the wrong rally. Your spending gets restricted because you bought too much of something the government thinks is bad for you. Your access to your own money gets cut off because you shared the wrong article on social media. This is exactly what's already happening in other parts of the world where digital currencies and social credit systems are being tested. The technology exists, the motivation exists, the infrastructure is being built. The only question is whether Americans will recognize the threat before it's too late. And the thing about this system from a control perspective is that it's invisible. When they freeze your account, there's no dramatic arrest, no public trial, no obvious oppression that might spark sympathy or outrage. Your card just stops working. Your payments just get declined. Your access just gets suspended for security reasons while they investigate your account activity. You become unpersoned without anyone even noticing because in a digital system, you only exist when the system says you exist. And if the system says you don't exist, well, good luck proving otherwise. But it doesn't stop with money, because money is just the first domino in a much larger system of control. Once your financial life is digital and trackable, everything else follows. Your healthcare becomes digital and trackable. Your travel becomes digital and trackable. Your communications become digital and trackable. Your very thoughts, as expressed through your online searches and social media activity, become digital and trackable. Suddenly, the government doesn't just know what you're doing, they know what you're thinking. And in a system where your access to everything depends on your compliance with government approval, thinking the wrong thoughts becomes a very expensive mistake. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning, and you go to check into your doctor's appointment using your digital ID, just like you've done dozens of times before. But today, the system pauses. A message appears. Account verification needed. Please contact customer service. Your appointment gets canceled. Your prescription refill gets delayed. Your insurance claims get put on hold. What happened? Well, maybe you shared an article about natural immunity that the algorithm flagged as medical misinformation. Maybe you questioned a new policy online. Maybe you liked the wrong post from a friend. The system doesn't tell you exactly what triggered the flag that would make it too easy to avoid in the future. The goal isn't to educate you, it's to make you anxious, uncertain, and compliant. This is the world we're building, one convenience at a time. A world where every website you visit, every purchase you make, every place you go, Every person you talk to gets added to your permanent digital record. And unlike the old days, when you could pay cash and walk away anonymously, or when different parts of your life were separate and private, everything becomes connected in one massive surveillance web. The genius of it, if you can call something this sinister genius, is that it happens gradually enough that each step feels normal. Today, you need your digital ID to renew your driver's license. Next month, you need it to register to vote. Next year, you need it to collect Social Security. The year after that, you need it to get hired for any job. And eventually, trying to live without it becomes like trying to live without electricity or running water, technically possible, but practically impossible in modern society. Now, you might be thinking, but I've got nothing to hide. If you're not doing anything wrong, why should you be worried? And I understand that sentiment. It's natural, it's human, and it's exactly what they're counting on. But here's the thing. Doing nothing wrong isn't a fixed standard. What's acceptable today might be illegal tomorrow. What's encouraged today might be criminalized next year. The same people who decide what counts as wrong are the ones who would control your digital ID, your access to money, and your ability to participate in society. Think about how much the definition of acceptable has changed just in your lifetime. Things your grandparents said freely are now considered hate speech. Political opinions that were mainstream when you were young are now called extremism. Medical questions that doctors used to encourage are now labeled as dangerous misinformation. The speed of this change is accelerating, not slowing down. And in a system where your ability to live depends on staying within the boundaries of acceptability, those boundaries become a moving target that you can never quite pin down. The result is self-censorship, self-policing, and self-silencing, which is exactly the goal. You see, the most effective censorship isn't the kind where they drag you away in the middle of the night. It's the kind where you do it to yourself because you're afraid of losing access to everything you need to survive. When your money, your healthcare, your housing, and your employment all depend on your digital ID staying in good standing, you become very, very careful about what you say, what you think, and who you associate with. Your right to privacy isn't conditional on your obedience to the government. Your freedom to speak your mind isn't something you have to earn through compliance. Your ability to control your own money isn't a privilege granted by bureaucrats. These are fundamental rights that belong to you simply because you're human. But in a digital ID system tied to programmable money, all of these rights become permissions that can be revoked at any time for any reason by people you've never met and can't hold accountable. And that's the key word, accountability. Who's making these decisions about your digital identity? Who decides what behavior is acceptable? Who determines what speech is allowed? Who controls the algorithms that flag your account? Who reviews the appeals when the system makes a mistake? The uncomfortable truth is that most of these decisions are being made by unelected officials in government agencies and programmers at tech companies, working together in ways that the public doesn't see and can't influence. There's no referendum on digital surveillance. There's no real public debate about whether we want to live in a society where every transaction is monitored and every movement is tracked. Instead, it's being rolled out piece by piece, behind closed doors, dressed up as technological progress and administrative efficiency. By the time most people realize what's happening, the infrastructure is already in place, the dependencies are already created, and opting out is no longer a realistic option. But here's the thing about American democracy that gives me hope. We still have ways to fight back, if we're willing to use them. The system isn't implemented yet. The infrastructure isn't complete. The legal framework isn't locked in stone. We still have time to change course. Right now, there are already efforts underway to oppose these systems before they become law. Petitions are circulating that have gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Some reports suggest the numbers are reaching into the millions, demanding that digital ID systems not be implemented without full public debate and consent. These petitions are forcing the issue into parliamentary and congressional discussions where it can't be quietly implemented behind closed doors. And your everyday choices matter more than you might think. One of the most powerful forms of resistance is also one of the simplest: use cash whenever possible. Cash is private, anonymous, and completely outside the digital surveillance system. Every time you pay with cash instead of a card, you're voting for privacy. You're voting for independence. You're voting for a world where not every transaction is recorded and monitored. I know using cash isn't always convenient, especially when so many businesses are pushing toward digital payments. But that's exactly why it's important. The more we rely on digital systems for everything, the easier it becomes for those systems to control us. Keeping cash alive keeps freedom alive. You can also support businesses and platforms that respect your privacy and don't require digital ID verification for every interaction. Vote with your wallet for companies that still believe in customer privacy. Use search engines that don't track you. Choose social media platforms that don't monitor your private messages. Support banks that still offer traditional services without requiring digital identity verification for basic transactions. And, perhaps most importantly, talk to your friends and family about these issues. One of the reasons these systems are being implemented so quietly is that most people don't understand what's happening or why it matters. They see digital convenience and think it sounds nice. They don't see the surveillance infrastructure being built around them. Help them understand that this isn't about technology, it's about power. It's about whether we want to live in a society where citizens are free or one where everyone needs government permission for basic activities of daily life. Share articles about what's happening in other countries, point out the incremental changes happening here at home, ask them simple questions. Do you want the government to know every time you buy groceries? Do you want your bank account to be turned off if you express the wrong political opinion? Do you want algorithms deciding whether you're allowed to travel? Most people, when they really think about it, don't want to live in that kind of world. The problem is that most people aren't thinking about it because the changes are happening slowly and quietly, wrapped in language about convenience and security. But there's something even more fundamental we need to understand about this entire issue. When you strip away all the technical details, all the policy arguments, all the promises about efficiency and security, digital ID systems are really about one thing: power. Who has the power to control how you live your life? Who has the power to monitor your behavior? Who has the power to cut off your access to money, healthcare, employment, and basic services? In a free society, that power belongs to you. In a surveillance society, that power belongs to whoever controls the digital systems. This isn't about left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative. Those old political categories are becoming increasingly irrelevant in a world where the real divide is between people who want to control others and people who want to be left alone. There are people on both sides of the traditional political spectrum who love the idea of having more power over their fellow citizens. And there are people on both sides who believe in individual freedom and limited government power. The digital ID issue cuts across party lines because it's fundamentally about human freedom, not partisan politics. The question we're facing as a society is simple. Do we want to live in a world where every citizen has the freedom to make their own choices, even when those choices aren't perfect? Or do we want to live in a world where algorithms and bureaucrats make those choices for us in the name of efficiency and security? Do we want to live in a world where you can disagree with your government without losing access to your money? Or do we want a world where financial survival depends on political compliance? These aren't small questions. These are the questions that will determine what kind of country we leave to our children and grandchildren. And the window for answering them is closing fast. The people pushing these systems are counting on our apathy, our distraction, our willingness to trade freedom for convenience one small step at a time. They're betting that by the time we realize what we've lost, we'll be too dependent on their systems to resist. But they're forgetting something important about Americans. When we finally wake up to a threat to our freedom, we don't just resist, we fight back with everything we've got. And right now, imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing you need government permission just to buy groceries, fill your gas tank, or even access your own money. Sounds like science fiction, right? But it's the very real path that digital ID systems are pushing us toward. Once introduced, they don't just make life easier, they make life controlled. And history shows us something important. When it's free, you are the product, and once freedoms are handed over, they rarely come back. Now, I've seen a lot of political rhetoric in my time, but this hit different. This wasn't about policy disagreements or partisan battles. This crossed into something much darker. Americans from all walks of life, Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who barely follow politics, they all had the same visceral reaction. There are lines you simply don't cross, and death used to be one of them. Even bitter political enemies once understood this basic principle of human decency. The reaction was swift, and it was overwhelming. Social media exploded with one message that cut across party lines, people calling for Omar's deportation. And here's what made this different from typical political controversies. It wasn't just conservatives angry at liberals or Republicans mad at Democrats. This was Americans across the political spectrum saying, no, you don't celebrate death. You don't kick a man's legacy while his family mourns. But here's where Trump's political genius comes into play. Most politicians would have issued a standard condemnation, maybe called for an apology, and moved on. But Trump? He saw something bigger. He understood that Omar had just handed him the perfect opportunity to reframe an entire debate about American values, and he took it. And just when emotions were boiling, Trump stepped in. When Trump responded, he didn't just defend conservatives or attack Omar's character. No, he did something far more strategic and devastating. He flipped the entire script by pointing directly at Somalia, Omar's country of origin, and laying out the stark contrast between that failed state and America. He talked about the poverty, the corruption, the decades of civil war, the fact that the vast majority of Somalia's population lives in extreme conditions that most Americans can't even imagine. But here's the masterstroke. Trump then asked the question that changed everything. How can someone from a failed state lecture Americans about how to run America? Suddenly, it wasn't about Trump defending conservatives anymore. It was about Omar trying to explain why she, of all people, had the moral authority to scold this nation. Now, I want you to understand what Trump did here from a strategic standpoint, because it's brilliant. He took Omar's cruelty toward a dead American and used it as a launching pad to discuss something much bigger, the question of loyalty and belonging. When Trump mentioned in one of his recent interviews that he would meet with Somalia's president and suggest they might want to take Omar back, he was only told, "I don't want her." He wasn't just making a joke. He was making a point about ingratitude, about someone who came here for opportunities and then spent her time attacking the very country that gave her those opportunities. But this wasn't just about words. It opened the door to something far bigger. Most people don't realize what Trump actually accomplished with his response, and this is where it gets fascinating from a political science perspective. By bringing up those long-circulating allegations about Omar's past, the questions about her marriage, the immigration fraud rumors that had been floating around for years, Trump forced something into the mainstream that the media had tried to bury. Now, I'm not here to relitigate those allegations, but here's what's important to understand. Trump dragged a conversation that had been whispered about in Washington circles right into the spotlight where millions of Americans could see it. For years, these questions had been dismissed as conspiracy theories. But when the President of the United States puts them on Truth Social for everyone to read, suddenly they can't be ignored anymore. And here's what most Americans didn't know. Omar's confident declaration that you cannot deport an American citizen wasn't entirely accurate. Now, she's technically right that it's extremely rare, but there's something called denaturalization that can strip citizenship from people who lied on their applications, committed marriage fraud, or concealed key facts during the immigration process. If someone commits treason, terrorism, or certain high crimes, they can lose their citizenship too. For those of you who lived through the Cold War, this might remind you of something. Do you remember when loyalty tests were part of American life? When questions about allegiance to this country weren't considered controversial, but necessary? There was an understanding then that citizenship came with responsibilities, not just rights. And I think that memory, buried deep in the American consciousness, is part of why Trump's message resonated so powerfully with older Americans. Suddenly, Omar wasn't untouchable anymore. She was forced into defense mode. The optics were devastating for Omar. When she appeared on CNN with Caitlin Collins, she looked nothing like the confident, progressive firebrand her supporters were used to seeing. Instead, she appeared nervous, defensive, almost panicked. When Collins pressed her about that Frankenstein post, Omar tried to deflect by saying she didn't have to agree with every word in something she shared. But here's the problem with that defense. The Frankenstein comparison wasn't buried in fine print somewhere. It was the entire point of the post she chose to share. Then came the moment that really showed her desperation. When pushed harder about the deportation calls, Omar snapped back with nervous energy, insisting you can't deport an American citizen. She tried to sound confident, but you could hear it in her voice she was trying to convince herself as much as the audience. And when the pressure intensified, she resorted to name-calling, dismissing her critics as idiots. Now, I've been around in this world long enough to know that when someone starts calling their opponents names, instead of addressing the substance, they've lost the argument. That's exactly what happened here. And if there's one thing Americans can smell, it's fear. What made this even more telling was the silence from Omar's usual allies. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders get attacked, you typically see statements of support, fundraising appeals, rallies, the whole progressive machine springs into action. But with Omar, cricket sounds. Her Democratic colleagues went quiet, donors started hesitating, and whispers about primary challenges began floating around progressive circles. That's how you know the walls are closing in, when your own party stops defending you and starts treating you as a liability instead of an asset. And if we know anything about the Democratic Party, it has no problem eating its own when someone becomes too toxic to defend. But the real hammer fell when Trump tied character to national loyalty. The contrast couldn't have been starker, and Trump knew exactly how to amplify it. While Omar was ridiculing the dead from behind her computer screen, Trump was standing shoulder to shoulder with Charlie Kirk's family at the memorial service, attended by tens of thousands of Americans. The vice president was there, major conservative leaders were there, and the message was crystal clear. This is how you honor the dead. This is how you show respect. This is what American values look like. Against that backdrop, Omar's cruel comments looked even more grotesque. Here you had families grieving, leaders showing respect, Americans coming together in a moment of loss, and Omar was tweeting memes comparing the deceased to a monster. The visual contrast alone was worth 1,000 political advertisements. But it got worse for Omar. Security had to deal with an armed individual who showed up near the memorial, someone impersonating law enforcement. Think about that for a moment. Families are trying to mourn, people are paying their respects, and someone shows up with weapons in what could have been an incredibly dangerous situation. That's exactly the kind of chaos that reckless rhetoric can unleash, and it was Omar's own words that helped fuel that atmosphere of anger and division. The lesson here is profound, and it's something every American needs to understand. Words have consequences. When leaders choose cruelty over decency, when they mock the dead instead of showing respect, they create an environment where anything becomes acceptable. And that's a dangerous path for any society to walk down. This moment wasn't just about one congresswoman, it was about the direction of America itself. You see, what we're really looking at here are two completely different visions for what America should be. On one side, you have Omar representing what I'd call multicultural progressivism, constantly criticizing America, pointing to its failures, trying to reimagine our national identity through the lens of grievance and oppression. To her supporters, she represents the future. To her critics, she represents everything wrong with modern politics. On the other side, you have Trump representing populist nationalism, America first, loyalty to country, preserving what made this nation exceptional in the first place. Trump doesn't apologize for America. He defends it. He doesn't ask what America can do better. He asks what America has done right and how we can build on that foundation. For those of you who lived through the great struggles that defined the 20th century, Trump's message probably resonates on a deeper level. You remember when loyalty and unity weren't just slogans, they were survival mechanisms. When pulling together as Americans wasn't considered controversial but necessary. When love of country wasn't seen as extremism but as basic citizenship. And this is why Trump's framing of Omar resonates so deeply. You've seen what happens when nations lose their sense of shared identity, when citizens stop believing in common values, when loyalty becomes optional. That historical perspective gives you something younger generations often lack the wisdom to recognize danger when you see it. But Omar's isolation wasn't just political, it carried a dangerous undertone. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in our current political climate, and that's the connection between reckless rhetoric and real-world violence. We saw this play out in terrifying fashion at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, where security had to deal with that armed individual I mentioned earlier. This person wasn't just carrying weapons, they were impersonating law enforcement, conducting unauthorized security sweeps in a crowd of thousands of grieving families. Think about how we got to that point. When political leaders choose outrage over responsibility, when they prioritize shocking statements over thoughtful discourse, they create an environment where anything feels justified. Omar's cruel mockery of Kirk's death didn't just hurt his family, it contributed to an atmosphere where some people felt violence was an appropriate response to political disagreement. This is what I mean when I say our politics are spiraling into a dangerous cycle. Outrage generates clicks, clicks generate money, money funds more outrage. Politicians compete to say the most shocking thing possible because controversy translates to attention, and attention translates to political power. But where does this road end? We're seeing glimpses of the answer, and it's not pretty. The difference between free speech and responsible speech is something every leader needs to understand. Yes, Omar has the right to say whatever she wants, regardless of how ignorant or cruel it might be. But leaders are supposed to know when not to exercise that right. They're supposed to put country above petty point scoring, unity above division, decency above politics. This is where Trump showed real leadership, and it's something that gets overlooked in all the noise. By standing with Kirk's family, by reframing the debate around loyalty and decency, by reminding Americans of values we used to share, Trump demonstrated what responsible leadership actually looks like. It's not about having the freedom to say anything, it's about having the wisdom to say the right thing at the right time. And that brings us to the bigger question, what does this moment mean for the future? Here's something I've learned from decades of observing human behavior. Character scandals last far longer than policy scandals. You can survive a bad vote on some spending bill. You can spin a controversial position on taxes or regulations. But when the public decides you lack basic human decency, when they see you as someone who celebrates death instead of showing respect, there's no coming back from that. Every opponent Omar faces from here on out is going to bring this up. Every debate, every campaign ad, every fundraising appeal, they're all going to reference the moment she mocked a dead man while his children were grieving. That's not a political liability. That's a career-ending anchor around her neck. But Trump understood something even deeper than that. He recognized that Omar's cruelty gave him an opportunity to shift the entire national conversation from should she apologize to should she even be here in the first place. That's political jujitsu of the highest order, using your opponent's momentum against them to achieve something much bigger than just winning an argument. By connecting Omar's Frankenstein comments to questions about her immigration history, Trump managed to make millions of Americans suddenly aware of something they'd never heard of before denaturalization. The legal process by which naturalized citizens can lose their citizenship if they obtained it fraudulently. Most people had no idea this was even possible, but suddenly it was part of the national conversation. Once trust is broken at this fundamental level, it rarely returns. And that's exactly what happened to Omar. She went from being a controversial but untouchable progressive icon to someone even her own party started viewing as a liability. The whispers about primary challenges, the silence from usual allies, the hesitation from donors, all of that tells you everything you need to know about her political future. But here's the catch. This isn't just about Omar. It's about where our politics is headed. We're at a crossroads as a nation, and the choice we make will determine what kind of country we leave to our children and grandchildren. Do we reward politicians who choose cruelty over decency? Do we normalize the mockery of death and the celebration of division? Or do we demand something better from our leaders? Do we insist that with great power comes great responsibility? That representing the American people means embodying American values? This is where your generation has a crucial role to play. You remember what this country was like when leaders understood the weight of their words, when public service meant serving something bigger than yourself, when loyalty to America wasn't considered controversial but essential. You have the historical perspective to recognize what we're losing, and the moral authority to demand we get it back. The danger isn't just that we have politicians like Omar who mock the dead, it's that we might be creating a system where such behavior becomes normal, where outrage is rewarded over decency, where division is more profitable than unity. That's a recipe for the kind of societal breakdown you've witnessed in other countries, the kind of collapse that happens when shared values disappear and common purpose evaporates. Look at what happened during the memorial service itself. Tens of thousands of Americans came together to honor one man's life, to comfort his family, to demonstrate that decency still matters in this country. President Trump and Vice President Vance were there not because it was politically necessary, but because it was morally right. That's the America you remember, isn't it? The America where we came together in times of loss, where we honored our dead regardless of political differences. The contrast with Omar couldn't have been starker. While thousands gathered to show respect, she was at home posting cruel memes. While leaders demonstrated what American values look like in practice, she was demonstrating what happens when those values are abandoned. The choice between these two approaches isn't really about politics, it's about the kind of society we want to be. But there's reason for hope in this story, and it comes from an unexpected source, the American people themselves. When Omar crossed that line of basic decency, Americans from across the political spectrum rejected her behavior. It wasn't just Republicans being partisan, it was Democrats, independents, and people who usually ignore politics entirely, all saying the same thing. This is not who we are. This is not what we accept. That gives me tremendous optimism about our future. It tells me that despite all the division and anger in our politics, Americans still share certain fundamental values. We still believe in respecting the dead, comforting the grieving, and maintaining basic human decency even in the heat of political battle. Those values aren't Republican or Democratic, they're American. The question is whether we'll demand that our leaders reflect those values, or whether we'll continue to reward the politics of outrage and division. The choice, ultimately, is ours. Every vote we cast, every candidate we support, every behavior we excuse or condemn, these are all decisions about the kind of country we want to live in. Trump's response to Omar showed us what leadership looks like when it's guided by principle rather than political calculation.